Hello, welcome to COM 222, Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to be going over nonverbal communication and Japanese culture. To start with nonverbal communication and culture, and we want to remember that culture is learned through observation and imitation, rather than by explicit verbal instruction or expression, especially nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is very subtle, it's non-linguistic, it's unconscious, and spontaneous. At times, we feel uncomfortable in other cultures because we intuitively know we are experiencing culture from a completely different perspective. So, for example, over here on the right-hand side, you have the person who is making what we call in the United States the OK symbol. In Japan, that is a reference to money. In France, that's a reference to zero. And in many countries, including Russia, Singapore, Germany, and so on, it's considered obscene because it represents a bodily orifice. So, oftentimes different cultures have different expectations about the nonverbal behavior. The most external, obvious code of nonverbal behavior is physical appearance, often the most important code used during initial encounters. Cultural attire is obvious and leads to ethnic stereotypes. So over here on the right-hand side, there is a woman dressed in traditional Japanese clothing with her child. This is not how the vast majority of people walk around in Japan. This is a cultural heritage in the same way that you have Americans who will dress up like Civil War soldiers and do reenactments at Gettysburg over July 4th. Little formal research has been conducted on the impact of physical appearance on intercultural communication. Perhaps the most fundamental code of nonverbal behavior is proxemics, communication via interpersonal space and distance. Research has documented that cultures differ substantially in their use of personal space and their regard for territory and the meanings they assign to proxemic behavior. For example, people from Mediterranean and Latin cultures maintain close distance, whereas people from Northern Europe and Northeast Asian cultures maintain greater distances. So if you meet somebody, for example, from Greece or Italy, they're probably going to stand much closer to you than you're comfortable with. And that is one of those dynamics that we see when Americans go to other countries, that, they're not used to people so tightly packed in together. Chronemics, or the study of meanings, usage, and communication of time, is probably the most discussed and well-researched nonverbal code in the intercultural literature. People's kinesic behavior differs from culture to culture, including some aspects of the facial expressions, body movements, gestures, and conversational regulators. Stories abound in the intercultural research of gestures that signal endearment or warmth in one culture, but may be obscene or insulting in another. Just think about that OK symbol. Tactile communication, called haptics, also shows considerable intercultural variation. Recent research has shown vast differences in international and intercultural touch in amount, location, type, and private or public manifestation. In the United States, we talk about public displays of affection, hugging, kissing, holding hands, and whether or not they're appropriate in each environment that a person is in. One important code of nonverbal communication that has had less intercultural research attention is Oculesics, the study of messages sent by the eyes, including eye contact, blinks, eye movements, and pupil dilation. Because eye contact has been called an invitation to communicate, its variation cross-culturally is an important communication topic. So how we speak with our eyes is very important because it changes radically from culture to culture. A culture's degree of individual or collectivism determines how people live together, alone, in families or tribes, their values, and how they communicate. Americans are extreme individualists, for better or for worse. Americans take individualism for granted and are blind to its impact until travel brings us into contact with less individualistic, more collectivistic cultures. Western culture is individualistic, so people rely on their personal judgments to a greater degree than on group decisions. On the other hand, Eastern cultures emphasize harmony among people, between people and nature, and value collective judgments. Sitaram and Kajal reported that individuality is of secondary importance in African cultures and of very little importance in Eastern and Muslim countries. So, when we think about individualism, this grand United States dynamic, we also have to keep in mind that we are not the international norm. We're actually unique in that consideration. I have some examples of characteristics of highly individualistic cultures. Take care of themselves and their immediate family first. The autonomy of the individual and the self are most important, whereas people who live in a collectivist culture, they work for the good of the group and suppress their identity for the benefit of the group. The needs of the group come before the needs of the individual. And again, this entire index or system travels down into various countries, and you'll see those listed there. So even though the United States is the most individualistic country on earth, some of its regions and ethnic groups diverge in their degree of individualism. As Bila and colleagues stated, individualism lies at the very core of American culture. Anything that would violate our right to think for ourselves, judge for ourselves, make our own decisions, live our lives as we see fit is not only morally wrong, it's sacrilegious. And the US is unique. All other cultures are less individualistic. So on the right, there's a little comic strip of, person saying, I'm unique. And then the other person says, I'm unique. And they're both wearing t-shirts that say F you with the middle finger. That's really a kind of a funny thing, because in the United States, we all have this sense of individualism that collectively makes us a group of lone wolves. The degree to which a culture is individualistic or collectivistic affects the nonverbal behavior of that culture in every way. People from individualistic cultures are more remote and distant proximally. So we don't stand as close to other people. Collectivistic cultures are interdependent, and as a result, the members work, play, live, and sleep in proximity to one another. Kinesic behavior tends to be more coordinated in collectivistic cultures, where people match one another's facial expressions and body movements are in sync with each other. People in individualistic cultures also smile more than do people in collectivistic-oriented cultures. Individualists are responsible for their relationships and their own happiness, but collectively oriented people regard compliance with norms as a primary value and personal or interpersonal happiness as a secondary value. Lustig and Kester maintain that people from individualistic cultures are more likely than those from collectivistic cultures to use confrontational strategies when dealing with interpersonal problems. In collectivistic cultures, people suppress both positive and negative emotional displays that are contrary to the mood of the group, because maintaining the group is a primary value. So again, the US, your average business person in the US is going to be much more confrontational than the leader of Japan or South Korea or China, because they're used to doing things in a very indirect way and maintaining that harmonic sense of getting along with each other. People in individualistic cultures are encouraged to express emotions because individual freedom is of paramount value. In individualistic countries such as the US, affiliation, dating, flirting, small talk, smiling, and initial acquaintance are more important than collectivistic countries where the social network is more fixed and less reliant on individual initiative. So, think about it from the perspective of when you met your love muffin. You might have met online, you might have met at a bar, you might have met in a classroom. However you met them, there is going to be a focus on, getting to know each other, getting to get that initial acquaintance. And in collectivist countries, that social network is you're going to date your cousin's friend, or you're going to only date people from within our town. In a study of dozens of cultures, Lomax found that a country's song and dance styles were related to its level of social cohesion and collectivism. So collectivist cultures are higher in groupiness and show both more cohesiveness in singing and more synchrony in their dance style. So over here on the right is another comic that kind of expresses the difference between individualism and collectivism. So the American father would say, you must learn to think for yourself. And the Asian father would say, you must do what is best for the family. So it's again that difference between focus on oneself and focus on others. Another basic dimension of intercultural communication is power distance, the degree to which power, prestige, and wealth are unequally distributed in a culture. Social systems with large power discrepancies are also produce unique kinesic behavior. Cultures with high power distance encourages emotions and nonverbal displays that reveal status differences. For example, in high-powered distance cultures, people are expected to show only positive emotions to people who are higher status than them, and only negative emotions to people who are low status to them. The power distance of a culture also affects vocalization and paralinguistic cues. Citizens of low power distance cultures are generally less aware that vocal tones are often perceived as noisy, exaggerated, and childlike. Lomax has shown that in countries where political authority is highly centralized, singing voices are tighter and the voice box is more closed, whereas in more permissive societies, the sound produced is more relaxed, open, and clear. Some cultures value change and ambiguity, whereas others value stability and certainty. Uncertainty is a cultural tendency to value risk and ambiguity. At the individual level, this quality is called tolerance for ambiguity. People with intolerance of ambiguity have high levels of avoiding uncertainty and seeking clear black and white answers. People with a tolerance for ambiguity tend to be more accepting of ambiguous answers and see many shades of gray. In some cultures, freedom leads to uncertainty, which leads to stress and anxiety. So, for somebody who has a low tolerance for risk, tends to want that black and white answer, whereas somebody who has a high tolerance for risk is okay with a shade of gray. Hofstede maintains that countries high in uncertainty avoidance tend to display emotions more than the countries that are low in uncertainty avoidance. Nonverbal behavior is more likely to be rule governed in countries with high uncertainty avoidance. So high, we want to make sure that there's no risk involved. So here's a snapshot of where we are in terms of uncertainty avoidance. The countries to the left have a very, very high level of avoiding risk or avoiding uncertainty, whereas the countries on the right, and you'll see the United States as fourth in that line, embrace risk. So you'll see that the United States, New Zealand, Ireland, British Hong Kong, Australia, they all came from British colonization. So a lot of this uncertainty avoidance context, or the willingness to take risks, came from the attitude of, we're going to go into this country and we're going to take over and we're going to take all of their resources and basically use them for our own purposes. And so there you go. There you see where that came from. When people from the United States communicated with people from a country such as Japan or France, both countries being high in uncertainty and avoidance, the Americans may seem unruly, nonconforming, and unconventional, whereas their Japanese or French counterparts may seem too controlled and rigid to the Americans. People from cultures that embrace uncertainty are much more likely to treat strangers with positive nonverbal behaviors such as smiles and other indications of immediacy and warmth. So again, we go back to this idea of the United States, Ireland, England. You go to these countries and people tend to be a little bit friendlier than if you were going to go into a country like Japan, where people are not so willing to risk that social interaction. On the right-hand side, the stereotypical picture of American tourists, and below that, the stereotypical picture of Asian tourists. Immediacy behaviors and interpersonal warmth are actions that signal closeness, intimacy, and availability for communication rather than avoidance and greater psychological distance. Examples of immediacy behaviors are smiling, touching, eye contact, closer distance, and more vocal animation. Some scholars have labeled these behaviors as expressive. Cultures that display considerable interpersonal closeness or immediacy behaviors have been labeled contact cultures because people in these countries stand close together and touch more. People in low contact cultures tend to stand apart and touch less, according to Patterson. Interestingly, contact cultures are generally located in warmer countries near the equator, and low contact cultures are often found in cooler climates further from the equator. Recent research suggests that the biggest differences in immediacy are not between North America and Europe, both of which are probably moderate to high contact cultures compared to the rest of the world. Asia is an extreme non-contact culture. So sure, there may be 1.3 billion Chinese living in China. They just don't always want to touch each other or be close to each other. Perhaps the most researched issue in social science during recent decades is gender. While humans can be viewed as masculine or feminine, so can nations and cultures. The gender orientation of a culture has an impact on many aspects of nonverbal behavior. This includes the nonverbal expressions permitted by each sex, occupational status, nonverbal aspects of power, the ability to interact with strangers or acquaintances of the opposite sex, and all aspects of interpersonal relationships between men and women. In less rigid cultures, both men and women can express more diverse, less stereotyped sex role behaviors. So, to kind of encapsulate it, masculinity cultures regard competition and assertiveness as important, whereas feminine cultures place more importance on nurturing and compassion. Now, over here on the right with the pictures, you could probably figure out that the guy on the top, James Marsden from Westworld, represents all that we imagine in masculinity. That strong jaw, walks tall, carries a big gun, has, that masculine affect. And then below him is a picture of an Asian girl, and she's in this very white, fluffy sweater. She is, got feminine looking hair. She's not overly made up. So she represents a femininity that is outside of the realm of lots and lots of makeup. Then we have androgynous patterns of behavior. Considerable research suggests that androgynous patterns of behavior, that is, having both feminine and masculine characteristics, result in more self-esteem, social competence, success, and intellectual development for both males and females. Nonverbal styles where both men and women are free to express both masculine traits, such as dominance and anger, and feminine traits, such as warmth and emotionality, are likely to be both healthier and more effective. So, in other words, you want to let your little boy, when he gets hurt, cry. Don't tell him to man up and to get over himself. Let him sob just like a little girl would, because you have to have both sides in order to manage both sides. The United States tends to be a more masculine country, according to Hofstede, although it is not among the most masculine. Intercultural communicators should keep in mind that other countries may be more or less sexually equal than the United States. So, because most countries are more feminine, that is, nurturing and compassionate, Americans of both sexes often seem loud, aggressive, and competitive by the world. Now, over here on the right, we have on the top picture an old-time movie actress, Marlene Dietrich, who is dressed in a tuxedo. She's from Germany, and at that time, when she came over in the 30s, Germany was very advanced in terms of their social beliefs, and it was very androgynous. And then when Hitler took over, it moved definitely more towards those masculine traits. And people like Marlene Dietrich got the hell out of Germany because they saw what was going on. So let's talk about Japanese cultural themes. Japan's predominantly homogeneous population embodies a particularly rich array of cultural themes. The more prevalent themes include group affiliation, which is also known as collectivism, hierarchy, social balance or harmony, which is also called wa, empathy, mutual dependency, perseverance, and sacrifice, otherwise known as geimin, humility, and formality, and they're big on rituals, traditions, and protocols. Confucian-based collectivism exerts a high influence on Japanese communication patterns. This societal closeness promotes an instinctive nonverbal understanding among Japanese people. The Japanese concept of collectivism is epitomized by their usage of the term Nihon Jinran to express self-perceived uniqueness as both a nation and a people. And I thoroughly apologize for butchering that Japanese term. So let's talk about some more of these cultural themes. And for your benefit and mine, I am no longer going to attempt to pronounce these Japanese terms because I'm just not able to do so. The hierarchical nature of Japanese society and inexorable compulsion for social balance or harmony increases the reliance on nonverbal behaviors and discourages verbal exchanges. A hierarchy exists in every instance of group or interpersonal interaction. The cultural pressure for social balance dictates the course of all Japanese activities and creates a persistent acceptance of ambiguity and vagueness during any communication endeavor. Reluctant to arbitrarily advance personal opinions or attitudes, the Japanese will draw on the situational context and attempt to instinctively discern what the other person is thinking. The cultural trait of empathy also lessens the Japanese reliance on verbal exchanges. In Japan, considerable value is placed on an individual's ability to empathetically determine the needs of another person. The Japanese enjoy a wide array of gestures. Usage, however, is situational and often limited to males. The Japanese are more relaxed and expressive with their in-group, so people like them. Away from the in-group, the use of body language is usually remarkably restrained. The most common activity associated with Japanese kinesthetics is the bow, which is an integral and repetitive part of daily social action. The Japanese bow is used when meeting someone, when asking for something, while apologizing, when offering congratulations, when acknowledging someone else, and when departing, to mention just a few instances. So if you think of an American parallel, think of how we will shake hands, with people to congratulate them or to say hello, things like that. Historically, a sign of submission, the bow is a contemporary ritual that continues to convey respect and denote hierarchical status. And you'll see over here on the right-hand side the different types of bows that are provided depending on who that person is interacting with. In Japan, prolonged eye contact is considered rude, threatening, and disrespectful. By avoiding eye contact, the participants in communication simultaneously demonstrate an air of humility and sustained situational wa. The employment of direct eye contact by a superior is a clear exercise of hierarchical prerogative. As is common to all aspects of their social behavior, the Japanese do not normally show any significant emotion through public facial displays. The most commonly observed expressions are either a placid, unrevealing countenance or a nondescript smile, whose actual meaning or intent may be totally indecipherable. Traditional Japanese women exhibit a distinct kinesic activity by obscuring facial areas with their hands or some other object, like a fan. For the Japanese, the smile is simply a part of social etiquette, designed to help sustain harmony. The smile is also used to avoid conflict. A Japanese person might simply smile in order to avoid answering an awkward question or giving a negative answer. In uncrowded situations, Japanese individuals assiduously strive to maintain personal space intervals that are even greater than those maintained by Americans. Conversely, when on a train or a bus, they accept frequent or even prolonged body contact with total strangers. And one of the things that you often see is Asian people will wear masks when they're out in public. And part of this is because of, this consideration of if I get too close to this individual and they're sick, I will get sick. But also it's a cultural dynamic that they prefer not to be sharing somebody else's air. Personal space is also close among friends or family members. Among in-group members where strong social ties exist, personal space is dramatically reduced. Traditionally, family members commonly slept in the same room, with even easy touching distance of each other. And really, it wasn't until the beginning of the 1900s did you see children and parents sleeping in separate areas, unless you were very wealthy. A lot of houses just had, two rooms. You had the main room and you had a bedroom, and you got to sleep wherever there was somewhere to sleep. Studies of Japanese maternal care found that children experience considerable touch from their mothers. And even today, parents and their young children will often share the same bed. Now, in the United States, there's a distinct recommendation to not co-sleep with your baby in case you roll over on them. But in other countries, co-sleeping for the first 6 months to a year is very normal, and it's actually considered to be a really good way of monitoring your baby's behavior as long as you are not rolling over on them. The amount of public tactile interaction drops individuals is expected to conform to societal non-touch standards. Adult Japanese actively avoid public displays of interpersonal physical expressiveness unless in a close-knit in-group setting. So, for adults, this in-group touching is acceptable. So they'll be affectionate with their families. They'll be affectionate with the people that they, spend quality time with as friends. But in general, they're not really looking to limit the amount of space between them and the other person. They would like to maximize it. Central theme of Japanese external appearance is, quite simply, group identity and status. The general tendency for conservative dress styles and colors emphasizes the nation's collectivism and lessens the potential for social disharmony arising from nonconformist attire. Lapel pins and uniforms signal a particular group affiliation, which in turn helps determine a person's social position. The Japanese business card is of considerable influence on Japanese nonverbal behavior and communication in general. And this is one of those things where if you're going to be doing business in Japan, you really need to know this. The business card represents the person, and if you are casual with that business card, if you do not look at it, if you just jam it into your pocket or bag, that is considered disrespectful. This facilitates rapid determination of the individual's group affiliation and person station, which dictates the correct deportment and appropriate speech levels for participants engaging in interpersonal dialogue. Hall and Hall have indicated that the Japanese use time polychronically among themselves and monochronically when conducting business with foreigners. So if you are a Japanese person and you are late to a meeting with other Japanese people, that is perfectly acceptable. But if you are an American meeting with Japanese people and you are late, that is completely unacceptable. The rigid adherence to schedules when dealing with foreigners is in contrast with the flexible timeliness exhibited during interactions with other Japanese. And in some way, if you think about the United States, if you think about Germany, if you think about Great Britain, they want you to be on time. And these countries, through the 20th century, pretty much dictated the social mores when dealing with foreign individuals. So Japan grew in this direction historically as their culture interacted with more and more people outside of the Japanese mindset. The Japanese decision-making process characterizes the influence of group orientation and social balance on the usage of time. In almost every interpersonal context, it is necessary to build a consensus before announcing a decision. During interpersonal discussions, the Japanese will constantly use small, culturally unique gestures and utterances to demonstrate their attentiveness. For the Japanese, laughter can possess a variety of meanings. Laughter can signal joy, of course, but it can also be used to disguise embarrassment, sadness, or even anger. Use of laughter in the latter situations is designed to maintain that situational harmony and avoid any potential for interpersonal discord. The significant role of silence in the Japanese communication process is attributed to a general mistrust of spoken words and an emphasis on emotionally discerning the other person's intentions. And as we have discussed, this is empathy. Silence is considered a virtue as well as a sign of respectability and trustworthiness. A pronounced feature of Japanese conversations is the many short pauses or breaks referred to as ma. According to Matsumoto, the Japanese closely attend to these brief conversational breaks. The pauses may convey meaning, demonstrate respect, or be an attempt to assess the other person or the situation. Instances of ma in Japanese discourse can impart a variety of messages, with the context supplying the actual meaning. Silence is employed to tactfully signal disagreement, non-acceptance, or an uncomfortable dilemma. A period of silence can be used to consider an appropriate response or formulate an opinion. Also, a junior may be silent in deference to a senior. And age is a very important aspect of the hierarchy in Japan. So somebody who is, 50 is going to be considered higher in status than someone who is 30. And, the 30-year-old may be making more money, but because of age and the reliance on using age as a way to reflect on respectability, you're going to look at that 50-year-old as having more status. So, when people who are speaking have different accents, vocabularies, and different rates of speech than the listeners, it is those seemingly minor language differences that usually present one of the biggest challenges to successful intercultural communication. In most instances, it is human nature to see similarity and differences, and to prefer similarity to differences. Research demonstrates that people tend to like others who possess attitudes and traits similar to their own, and to dislike others with dissimilar attitudes and traits. And if you're not sure about that, just go on Facebook, say something about a politician that you loathe, and you're going to find out exactly what people think. Consequently, friendships are formed more readily with people perceived to be from similar groups, i.e., cultural groups, religious groups, sports team groups, etc. This preference for similarity is part of the interculturally relevant phenomenon of ethnocentrism. According to Sumner, ethnocentrism occurs when members of a culture view themselves as the center of everything and judge other cultures according to the standards and practices of their own culture. Of course, those who are most similar appear to be better. Ethnocentrism occurs naturally in people across all cultures. So there's a joke on the internet about how Americans see the world. And what you'll see is in blue, it says the best country in the world. And of course, that's the USA. North of it, Canada, friends with benefits. Up until President Trump, we had an excellent relationship with Canada. And, when this was developed, the perception was that Canada is really an offshoot of the US. Of course, everything from Mexico all the way down to Patagonia considered Latinos. And then over on the right, the green or lime green kind of, Africa, the biggest country. Because it is unfortunate, but many Americans do not realize that Africa is a continent made up of many, many countries and not just one monolithic country. Then we have Northern Europe and Southern Europe, where you say all of our ancestors. Where you see Spain, we're saying, nope, not our ancestors. And then our baby, which is kind of below Italy, would be Israel, which we have been accused of having preference for. Then you see Asia, giant monolithic. Japan is just there for the anime. And Australia is all the weird animals like kangaroos. The point being is you don't even have the Middle East here. You don't have many of the other countries in this world because Americans have a very ethnocentric perspective. I don't necessarily agree that everyone in the US is ethnocentric, but I think at least 30% of people in this country think that every other country is less than the US. Of the language behaviors that have been investigated, accent is one of the most revealing. Research has shown that listeners have clear attitudes towards those who speak differently. Accent attitude research makes it abundantly clear that we often prejudge others in unflattering and potentially harmful ways based on accent alone. American listeners who themselves speak with a standard American accent consistently prejudge others with Appalachian, Spanish, German, African American accented speech as less intelligent, poorer, less educated, and less status possessing than standard accepted speakers. For example, Bishop in 1979 found that white female respondents evaluated African American Confederates as less responsible and less desirable coworkers when they spoke Black as opposed to white English. Similarly, Giles, Williams, Mackey, and Rosselli discovered that Anglo respondents rated the same bi-dialectical speaker as less literate and more lower class when he spoke English with a Hispanic accent compared to the Anglo accent. Now, amusingly enough, if you are to go to England or Ireland or Scotland, they don't think Americans speak English. They say we speak American because we butcher the language in ways that they would be horrified. So, it's all perspective. And that's the important thing. You can have somebody who comes from Liberia who has a master's degree in nursing, but has to start over when they get to the US. This person is highly educated and knows a lot. However, because they have an accent, people automatically assume they are dumb or they lack education. Surprisingly, though, standard accented listeners are not the only ones who look down on many non standard accented speakers. Even listeners who themselves speak with non standard accents often judge that others who sound like themselves have a lower social standing. So, when you have somebody who is lower socioeconomics, they're from the South, and they're going to criticize people as white trash, for example, because they may have a slightly thicker accent. So it's something like that we're talking about here. So another aspect are speech styles. In addition to accent, a speaker's choice of words or grammatical phrase may also lead others to some potentially harmful and erroneous prejudgments. We know that a shopper may say to another, "Hey, please hand me that bag of t-shirts over there. Thanks." Alternatively, the same shopper might say, "Excuse me, you wouldn't mind passing that package of undershirts to me, would you? Thank you." In both instances, the same idea or message content is expressed. However, the speech styles are quite different. In the first message, listeners may gain the impression that the speaker is strong and confident, whereas the second message may suggest that the speaker is weak, uncertain, and consequently socially unattractive. Such impressions may or may not be deserved. Regardless, listeners, usually subconsciously, treat the speech styles that our messages take as accurate information about our character and abilities. So when we are speaking, depending on who we're talking to, if you use that, "Excuse me, would you mind?" to an older person, they would think you're very polite. If you say it to a younger person, they're going to think you're a nerd, a dork, or whatever word they want to use. Over here on the right, the top picture is a scene from Wayne's World where he opens his window and he says, "Pardon me, do you have any Grey Poupon?" Which, of course, is from an old commercial, which probably most of you have never seen before. But it was two Rolls Royces stopped at a red light, and the one guy, lets his window down and says, "Pardon me, do you have any Grey Poupon?" And it's demonstrating that people of extremely high levels of taste love this particular kinds of mustard. The picture below, where the son is, "Could you please pass," or "Could you pass the ketchup, mustard, chili, onions, and sauerkraut?" So basically everything, there's no please, there's no politeness, but he's with his family. So, we change our style of speech often depending on the context. Speech that includes features such as hesitations, for example, or hedges, "I sort of think so," tag questions, "Is it cold in here? Isn't it?" And polite forms, "Excuse me," are often called powerless features. The speech style is often used by women and usually leads others to perceive them as less powerful than men. Several studies have shown that whoever uses the language features in this powerless speech style, whether a man or woman, is thought by listeners to be both less socially attractive, i.e., less trustworthy and less likable, and less competent, i.e., less educated and less intelligent than others not using this style. An unintentional choice of words or phrase may unknowingly, both to the speaker and the listeners, lead to some unfavorable and potentially inaccurate judgments that can make some type of communications more difficult. Alongside accent and speech style, speech rate is another important language behavior. Speakers naturally vary in the number of words or syllables they utter per minute. This can be a function of their personality, their age, their situation, or their fluency in language. Regardless of the actual source of the speech rate, variability, for example, is someone speaking slowly because he or she is scared, shy, old, or has just learned the language, listeners consistently think that people who speak faster are more competent and more socially attractive than people with relatively slow rates of speech. And this is especially true in the Philadelphia region where, fast talking is prevalent and is considered a social norm. So if you look at the top picture on the right, that's a map of the United States. You have people from Delaware and below who say y'all. And then, of course, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and over towards the West say you guys. Again, this is a concept where we make presumptions about a person because of the way they speak. And, if nothing else from this lecture, you have to take each individual and give them the benefit of the doubt. You must give them the dignity and respect that they are due until they have proven themselves dumb or incompetent. Also, I like this little picture down here. Kill your speed before it kills your speech. Speed kills even in public speaking. So, having that ability to speak publicly is very difficult. It's the number one fear in the United States. But once you master it and you learn the nuances, then it is something like any other skill, like riding a bike. You just learn the best ways to do things. These same language differences can also lead to discrimination. Oftentimes, when others sound different from ourselves, we not only think unfavorably of them, but also in many cases treat them unfairly. This fact has been most clearly demonstrated in the case of people who speak with different accents. In the case of a job interview, in an important study by Henry and Ginsberg in 1985, individuals with different ethnic or racial accents made telephone inquiries about jobs advertised in a newspaper. Job applicants who spoke with a non-standard accent were most often told that the jobs had been filled, whereas applicants with a standard accent were most often invited to appear for a personal interview even after the non-standard speakers were informed that applications for the position were no longer being accepted. So, people call in, they have a certain sound, and that either falls into the acceptable or unacceptable categories. So, when participants come from the same nation but different co-cultures, the language differences may not be as striking. Even so, the ability of language attitudes to influence interaction does not diminish. In fact, they may intensify. Co-cultures can still socialize differences in all forms of language behavior. For example, Asian Americans may use polite forms of talk more than Anglo-Americans, and speakers from the South may engage in slower speech than those from the North. So if you look over on the right, this picture, you have the fastest speakers come from Oregon, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Kansas, and Iowa, and the slowest speakers come from North Carolina, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Because these differences appear, or because we expect them to appear, language attitudes still play an important role in intercultural communication between co-cultural group members. Consequently, responsible communication should seek both to understand and to manage their language attitudes. Language attitudes can provide critical, readily available, and yet usually unreliable information about our conversational partners. Given this, how should responsible intercultural communicators manage language attitudes? The first and most important thing to do is recognize when your response to others are based on language attitudes alone and when they are based on other, more objective and more reliable information. Ask yourself, Am I thinking this about the person only because of the way he or she speaks? For example, in universities across the United States, students often respond unfavorably to foreign-born teaching assistants and professors. Who is responsible for such student dissatisfaction? In some cases, there really are instructors with verifiably poor language skills. However, in many other cases, it may be in fact the stereotypical and prejudicial language attitudes developed by the students themselves that are responsible. Once you learn to recognize the role language attitudes play in your responses, a second step should be to seek out and integrate additional information into the evaluation to determine if your evaluation is accurate and appropriate. Okay, so that's going to do it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text message your instructor. If you do not attend our college but still have a question, leave it in the comment section and we will respond as soon as we can. Thank you and have a fabulous day.